come before the court is Dyer versus Dalton. Are both sides ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. You each will have 15 minutes, as you know, and the appellant may reserve up to 5 minutes if you so desire, so just let me know. Thank you.
Thank you. May it please the court, my name is Gary Bankowski. I represent the appellant in this case, and she is actually seated here back in the courtroom. Her name is Melody Dyer. Melody underwent a laparoscopic cholecystectomy on February 1st, 2013, gallbladder surgery. And laparoscopic meaning it was minimally invasive. And scope was used as opposed to an open procedure. In the early 1990s, lap choles made their debut in the United States. And there was a trade-off because with minimal incisions, people who underwent the surgery were normally back to work in roughly a day or two following the surgery. It was done on an outpatient basis. However, the trade-off was that it was more difficult to visualize things because you're looking through a camera instead of seeing it directly with your eyes and feeling with your hands. When surgeons perform open surgeries, they use their hands quite a bit to feel what's inside. So in the initial period of time, in the early 1990s, there was a higher incidence of biliary leaks, which can be very devastating injuries. And a group of physicians led by Nathaniel Soper created a technique that's called the critical view of safety. And the design was to make it safer to perform a laparoscopic cholecystectomy without major damage to any of the biliary ducts. I brought a few diagrams. Is it okay to use those?
That's fine. As long as these are...
These were all used at the trial.
That's what I was just going to say.
This was Exhibit 33. The sticker was at the bottom of the page, and if I put the sticker on, it would be all blank space as opposed to it. But this is Exhibit 33, and this was actually identified at the defendant's expert's deposition, and it just goes to show the various configurations that can exist for a gallbladder. This is the most typical presentation for a gallbladder. The gallbladder is here. This is the common bile duct, common hepatic duct, left hepatic duct, right hepatic duct, and above the ducts sit the liver. Liver produces bile, which drains into the hepatic ducts, and it actually accumulates in the gallbladder. The gallbladder has two functions. It stores bile, and it concentrates bile. So when you eat greasy or fatty foods, there's a muscle down here, it's called the sphincter voti, opens up, the gallbladder contracts, and it pushes bile into the digestive tract to help us digest our foods. Now, the critical view of safety, and went through this with the defendant in his cross-examination at the beginning of the case. The way the critical view of safety is obtained, this would be the liver that you see here, and this is the gallbladder, and this is the neck of the gallbladder. This would be the cystic duct, and this would be the cystic artery. What a surgeon has to do when they're performing a laparoscopic cholecystectomy, performing the critical view, is they have to isolate the neck. First of all, they draw the neck of the gallbladder down from the base of the liver. And they pull it downward. About a third of the gallbladder is drawn down. It gives you access. And this triangle that's in here is called Callot's triangle. And the surgeon has to remove all fibrous and fatty tissue and isolate or skeletonize the cystic artery and the cystic duct. Before any cuts or surgical clips can be placed on these items, you have to clearly identify them. If there are more than two structures emanating from the neck of the gallbladder, you have to perform the critique, or the critical view of safety says that you need to either do one of two things. Perform a intraoperative cholangiogram where an incision is made in the cystic duct and dye is injected and the photographs taken, and it illuminates the entire biliary tree so you can see what the anatomy is. Or the alternative is you can perform an open procedure. You withdraw the laparoscope and open the patient and do a visual examination. In this case, Dr. Dalton, the defendant, performed a laparoscopic cholecystectomy and continued and made incisions and clipped what he believed were the the cystic duct and the cystic artery. Immediately following the surgery, the evening of the surgery, Mrs. Dyer was ill, and she presented back to the hospital, and she was complaining of severe pain, which is unusual in gallbladder surgery. Most people tend to get better right away, but she continued to falter, and it was discovered later on that she had a biliary leak. It was a major leak. She was at one time leaking, I think the testimony was like 900 milliliters. That's like a large bottle of Pepsi, almost 1,000 milliliters. When you buy water in the grocery store, you're familiar with how much water is contained in that. So she was leaking that much in a day, and this went on for a period of time. She eventually came under the care of Dr. Lowe at Akron General Medical Center, and what I'm getting ahead of myself, he performed, no, I'm not really. He performed a procedure, it's called PIC, and this is actually Exhibit 11. Again, it's contained, there's multiple views, and this is the best view in Exhibit 11. But it's a percutaneous transhepatic angiogram. In other words, there's a catheter that's introduced through the skin, that's percutaneous. Transhepatic means it goes through the liver and into bile ducts within the liver. You can actually see the catheter here, and this is where the injection takes place. And they're injecting dye into the upper portion inside the liver to try to define where the problem is. And you can see that there are two surgical clips here. This is where the injury occurred to Mrs. Dyer's right hepatic duct. You can also see this darkened area over here, and this device here is a pigtail catheter that's used to drain. This collection here is called a biloma. You can actually see there's a tracer going across here to the biloma where there was a spontaneous rupture of this intrahepatic duct, and she was leaking bile and was accumulating in her abdominal cavity. So this wasn't discovered until June 5th of 2013. Dr. Lowe and Dr. Alonger performed a surgery to correct this, and they did a procedure where they actually took a portion of her jejunum and used it as a conduit, and they actually came up to this area. They cut it off to make a fresh edge, and then they sewed the piece of jejunum to create a conduit where her bile would continue to drain into the digestive system. There were 4 physicians who testified in this case. Dr. Valentine for the plaintiff and Dr. Modlin for the plaintiff. Valentine is a general surgeon who has done many laparoscopic cholecystectomy, and Dr. Modlin, who is a gastroenterologist. They're both from Yale, were professors there. And they testified that Dr. Dalton violated the standard of care and caused injury to Mrs. Dyer when he inadvertently put clips on her hepatic duct and cut her right hepatic duct. This is a diagram, Plaintiff's Exhibit 32, and it's actually the original sketch was made by the defendant's expert in this case, Dr. Morrison. The addition that I made when I marked it as Plaintiff's Exhibit 32, I think it's Defendant's Exhibit A, I had Dr. Morrison indicate where the cystic artery was, because he testified that this was an aberrant duct called the right posterior hepatic duct, and when Dr. Dalton did the surgery, he missed this, or actually clipped it and cut it, and that's where the injury took place. Well, if you go back to the original statement, and as I said, I went through very thoroughly with Dr. Dalton in his direct examination, that you have to isolate the neck of the gallbladder when you do this procedure, and there should be only 2 structures. In this case, according to Dr. Morrison, there are actually 3 structures: the cystic duct, the cystic artery, and this so-called aberrant right hepatic duct.
Counsel, I'm going to interrupt you for a second because you didn't indicate whether you wanted rebuttal time or not.
Yes, I would like to reserve 5 minutes. We're probably close to that.
We're already 5 or 15 left, that's it.
All right, thank you.
Sorry about that.
May it please the court, Leanne Fink of Retzel and Andrus on behalf of the Appellees, Arthur Dalton, MD, and Dalton and Ben Fossen, Surgeons, Inc. I just want to say I'm honored to be here for the inaugural argument today. As an initial matter, appellant has not challenged the trial court's November 14, 2017 order overruling her motion for new trial. As such, that is not an issue before the court on appeal. Instead, appellant has alleged only one assignment of error. The jury's verdict was against the manifest weight of the evidence. As this court is well aware from its own long-standing precedent, the standard for overturning a jury's verdict as against the civil manifest weight of the evidence is highly deferential to the trier of fact and guided by the presumption that the findings of the trier of fact are indeed correct. In fact, judgments supported by some competent, credible evidence will not be reversed by a reviewing court as being against the manifest weight of the evidence. Here, in order to reverse the jury's unanimous verdict in favor of appellees, this court must determine that the jury clearly lost its way and created a manifest miscarriage of justice. This type of determination is one that is both exceptional and uncommon. In fact, under the Ohio Constitution, a reversal of this nature of the jury's verdict, based upon the manifest weight of the evidence, would require a unanimous decision from this court. However, based upon the record in this case, it is clear that the jury's verdict in favor of appellees is supported by competent, credible evidence, and that the jury rejected appellant's theory of the case and instead accepted appellee's theory of the case. Indeed, as the trier of fact, the jury has the duty to weigh the evidence and is therefore free to accept it, reject it. It's also free to believe all, part, or none of the testimony given by the witnesses who appear before the court. The record in this case will actually show that Judge Kimbler allowed the jury to ask questions of the witnesses if they had further questions or needed clarification before witnesses left the stand. So the jury had the opportunity to fully clarify anything that could have been misunderstood at the time. Here, as appellant has demonstrated today, their theory of the case, as was presented to the jury, and which is the only theory advocated on appeal, argued that Dr. Dalton was negligent because he failed to follow the critical view of safety technique during appellant's gallbladder removal surgery, thus causing injury to appellant's right hepatic duct, which in turn caused a bile leak. The jury, however, rejected this theory of the case, which it is allowed to do under well-established law. And instead, the jury accepted appellee's theory of the case, which is supported by competent, credible evidence in both the testimony and exhibits presented by appellee's experts, by Dr. Dalton, and also in the testimony elicited from appellant's experts during cross-examination. I'm just going to take a moment to go through some of the evidence that I think will be helpful to the court in making a determination in this case. Dr. Dalton's expert witness, Dr. Morrison, who is a well-credentialed surgery expert, testified that bile duct injuries can occur in this type of surgery in the absence of negligence, even if the critical view of safety technique is followed. You can find this testimony in volume 6, pages 616 to 618 of the transcript.
But counsel, just because it can happen doesn't mean that that negates negligence.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that there was negligence. So
On its face, right?
On its face, exactly. So, and that essentially was appellant's theory of the case, that if the critical view were followed, this could not possibly happen. And so the jury heard both sides of this. The jury heard from Dr. Morrison through the use of his diagram, which is Defendant's Exhibit A, and also the radiology dye studies. These are commonly known as ERCPs, and the cholangiogram. Dr. Morrison explained to the jury that appellant actually had an anatomic anomaly, which was described on the record as an aberrant posterior right hepatic duct, and I believe that's what you see drawn in red on defendant's Exhibit A.
Counsel, and
Yes.
this is beyond your knowledge, I get it, you're not a doctor.
Okay.
I'm curious, is there any imaging methodology that could have been performed that would have picked up on that anomaly?
I think that if they were aware of it, that possibly what counsel had said, the Angiogram or using the Dyer study
I
could
need
have.
to make them aware of it before the surgery even commences.
I don't believe so, because I don't think that would have been a typical thing to do prior to opening up with the incisions for the laparoscopic surgery.
Counsel, I was actually thinking the same question that Judge Callahan asked. I mean, I was going to add to it this. Was there anything in the record that talked about whether they had done sufficient testing or if they should have done the testing to see if there was any of those anomalies?
The record goes through that Dr. Dalton did his own history with the patient. He went through everything that a typical surgeon would go through prior to this type of surgery. So because there was no indication prior that there was any type of anatomic anomaly, then this further testing just would not have been done. But you'll see in the record where on Dr. Dalton's direct examination and even on cross, where he explains everything that he did and how he reviewed the patient history, spoke with the patient, did all of this prior to engaging in the surgery.
Did their expert talk about how common these anomalies are and how to prepare for them in advance?
Your Honor, I don't believe that that was discussed.
Okay. And obviously that's a question for appellant as well. Thank you.
Dr. Morrison effectively explained to the jury that the critical view of safety technique is not as simplistic as it would have appeared to be from appellant's experts' diagrams and testimony. And this is because they were two-dimensional. And so Dr. Morrison explained that the human body has more fatty tissue than is demonstrated on these exhibits that you saw here today, and that there is distortion of structures that were not illustrated in Dr. Moodland's and Dr. Ballantyne's drawings and diagrams. The jury also heard both of appellant's experts, Dr. Moodland and Dr. Ballantyne, admit that a bile duct injury is a potential risk associated with this type of surgery, that bile duct leaks are not uncommon with this type of surgery, and that surgeons generally discuss this risk with their patients prior to surgery. And you can find this testimony in transcript volume 3, page 208, and transcript volume 4, pages 393 through 394.
Well, counsel, they do, and there doesn't seem to be any dispute in this case that it was discussed, but, you know, gee, I can have this surgery and I can be back to work on Monday, or no, doctor, let's not have those risks, cut me open and I'm gonna stay out and work 3 weeks to a month with significantly more pain. You know, is the patient really given the information the patient needs? I guess I ask this because I see a lot of these cases, and I realize I see them because you don't get the successful surgeries in court.
Right.
But it kind of makes you wonder, is that informed consent really informed consent?
Your Honor, that's a great question. I don't think that that was part of
And it's
Of
not
this-
the issue before.
of this appeal, but I understand what you're saying, and it's, you know, whether or not a patient would choose the laparoscopic surgery or to be opened up, I think there's risks with both. And so that's why, you know, this case is an anomaly. And so actually, Dr. Maudlin, I believe, agreed that in medical literature, these bile duct injuries are reported without any reference to negligence. So it doesn't necessarily mean because this happened that the doctor was negligent. And those were the two theories of the case. And simply stated, Your Honors, appellant failed to meet her burden of persuasion that Dr. Dalton deviated from the standard of care, either because the jury either disbelieved appellant's theory of the case, that if the critical view of safety were followed, it would not be possible for a bile duct injury to occur, Or the jury simply found Dr. Morrison to be more credible than Drs. Moulin and Ballantyne. And either way, Your Honors, respectfully as the trier of fact, the jury is perfectly within its purview to make these types of determinations based upon the competent, credible evidence before the jury. And the fact that the jury agreed with Appellee's theory of the case, or found Appellee's experts to be more credible, is not legal justification to reverse the jury's verdict as against the manifest weight of the evidence. Your Honor, therefore, appellees Dr. Arthur Dalton and Van Fossen Surgeons, Inc. respectfully ask this court to overrule appellant's sole assignment of error and uphold the jury's unanimous verdict in favor of appellees. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, counsel.
I'd like to go back to the diagrams.
Wait just one second. I was just going to tell you, I'm going to start the time, and you do have your full 5 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
To answer Judge Callahan's question, I think the one question was, how often does this occur? Often enough that we need to be careful when we do this procedure. And I think you'll see the testimony is that these are terrible injuries when these happen. If you read the record of this case, my client has gone through tremendous amount of medical treatment, and she's going to have a problem the rest of her life with her digestive system because of this injury. So these are some of the various combinations that occur, and the critical view of safety was brought about to avoid having to define the specific anatomy of each and every one of these presentations. And there are actually more presentations than we actually see here. This is actually a presentation that Dr. Morrison testified to in his deposition, where he said this is what the injury looked like and this is what the clip was like, compared to what he has here, with clips being down here and clips up there. And he even testified differently, or I'm sorry, in his medical report when I cross-examined him. So he actually had like 3 different versions as to what's going on in this particular case. But the critical view is so important because it tells us, irrespective of what the right hepatic duct and left hepatic duct look like from above, we have to concentrate on the area where the gallbladder is being removed. It's the neck of the gallbladder. And if we see something that's there besides the cystic duct and the cystic artery, which Dr. Morrison testified actually occurred in this case, 3 structures, question was asked, is there a way to define the anatomy in this case? And the answer is yes. If there's a question about the anatomy, and when you have 3 tubular structures emanating from the neck of the gallbladder, that tells you there's an issue, and you have to define the anatomy by one of 2 methods. An intraoperative angiogram, again, where an incision is made in the cystic duct and dye is injected, and an X-ray, live X-ray is taken to demonstrate what the anatomy is. So this type of problem can be avoided. The second method is to do an open procedure where you actually open the patient up, and you can do it physically by examining with your eyes and examining with your fingers to palpate and see where these ducts are going. The jury was misled in this case to believe that my client had an aberrant right hepatic posterior duct, and that was the cause of the problem. That's not the issue in this case, because whether it's an aberrant right hepatic duct, or whether it's an aberrant left hepatic duct, or any other aberration, the problem can be found at the critical view when we examine what's going on there. And once you see that there's more than 2 structures there, you know there's an issue and it has to be addressed. And that's what the defendant failed to do in this case. And my client ended up with clips being placed across her right hepatic duct, which obstructed her biliary system, spontaneously ruptured, created a biloma, made her very ill, and she has a conduit system now that's very different than her original conduit system, where bacteria can migrate back up through the channel that was created into her liver, predisposing her to repeated infections in the future. She's actually had one of those previously, where she had to go back into the hospital. She was seriously ill at that time, and Dr. Morrison testified that this can recur. As far as the case law is concerned, it is true that you 3 have to decide unanimously that there's a manifest weight of the evidence issue and the case should be reversed. The Eastwood case, I believe it was, indicates that you do not have to file a motion for a new trial or a motion for a directed verdict in order to have an analysis of manifest weight of evidence in the Court of Appeals. I agree that the standard is that there has to be competent, credible evidence. In this case, the testimony of Dr. Morrison is not credible. He changed the version of how this occurred, had three different versions as to what actually happened, and he disagrees with the defendant in this case. The defendant admits, when he's cross-examined, that when you perform the critical view of safety, you have to completely remove the fatty tissue around the neck of the gallbladder to identify the structures that are emanating from the gallbladder so you can verify what's there. Dr. Morrison in this case disagrees with the other three people that testified in this case and said, well, you don't have to remove all the fatty tissue. Well, if you're going to find whether or not there's more than more than two structures emanating from the neck of the gallbladder, you better remove the fatty tissue in this callow triangle and identify what structures are there in order to prevent causing the type of injury that was created in this case.
Thank you, counsel, you're out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you both for your presentations to the court, and the court will take the matter under advisement and will issue a written opinion that will be sent to both sides, as well as we will release the opinion electronically on our website, which will be on the Supreme Court website as well. Thank you again.